great. So we've got a few people that have never attended a Black Sun event. So welcome to you. And we've got lots of old friends here. So that's fantastic. Super that not many of you are aware of the FTSE 100 research that we do. So now you know the history of it and how long we've been doing it, which is great. And I'm really glad to see that we've got some people that are extremely aware of it. And I am so excited to see that more than half of you are keen to see people as soon as possible. And the majority of you are keen to meet up with us soon. So what I wanted to just say is that actually we've got our first live proper event with the FRC in September. So more on that a little bit later, but that will be a live event, a half-day conference with the FRC, and I hope to see a lot of you there. And we're kindly being hosted by our client Schroders at their beautiful atrium. So it will be a great morning. So I hope you can join me. Okay, so to move on, just a couple of quick introductions before we get started, so you know who's going to be on the call with us. So my name is Sally Pilot. I lead the advisory team at Black Sun and look after Insight Engagement. I've been around for a long time, as you probably know, and I'm joined today by two colleagues in the advisory team at Black Sun, Harriet and James, who you'll hear from later on, but they bring a great wealth of expertise and knowledge in the ESG, investor communications, and sustainability areas. So moving on, a little bit about Black Sun for those of you that don't know much about us and would love to tell you more about us another day, but I'll just very quickly tell you that really what we do is we help ambitious global organizations to understand their audiences. We help them to bring to life their value creation story, and we help them build enduring relationships with all of their stakeholders. And we really have a passion and a belief in the fact that reporting and communications can be used to spark positive change and drive long-term sustainable performance. And we really do see reporting, as onerous as I know it is for many people, we see that it should be really seen as an opportunity to drive change rather than an obligation. And I get so excited when people can see the power of reporting. So if we just move on a bit, I already told you a bit of the background to the Complete 100 research, which we're talking about today, but I also wanted to make you all aware that we do also track the trends in corporate websites. So our Web 100, which we've been doing for almost as long, is going to be launched in 2 weeks' time. And again, please get in contact if you want to see what we've got to share then. We'd love to see you there as well. Okay. Moving on, with close to 20 years of analyzing the trends in reporting, which in my mind fundamentally track changes in business behavior, standing still, as the saying goes, is the quickest way of going backwards, which is the title of our report. Now, why do I say that? The reason I say that is because the context in which companies are operating has dramatically changed. With things like climate change, nature loss, social unrest, all of this is exacerbated by the global pandemic and most recently the conflict in Ukraine. And changing stakeholder expectations, the global flow of information, government, climate targets, and digitally enabled transparency are all driving seismic change. So I don't think inaction is an option for companies today. So moving on a bit, some of the things that I know that everybody is grappling with is we have a hugely complex evolving regulatory landscape for companies to deal with, a plethora of frameworks and standards and initiatives, all demanding more information from corporates. We've seen the debate on the importance of sustainability information for investors and other stakeholders has never been more important. You'll all be well aware of the 3 major consultations going on in sustainability reporting. If any of you have read them cover to cover, you'll have read over 1,000 pages of consultation between the SEC, EFRAG, and ISSB's consultations. And really this focus tells us that there is no option to stand still anymore. We need to move forward. It's a new world that we're operating in. And really this focus elevates sustainability standards and reporting to the same level as financial reporting. And that's going to change, require a lot of fundamental change and thinking internally about what that means. Now, if you haven't engaged with the consultations, I encourage you to, because your voice needs to be heard. There is a convergence on a lot of these things, and there is a will for all of these bodies to be working together, but still they need to hear from corporates. We will be submitting a response to the ISSB, so if anybody wants to contribute views, we would love to hear it. We did a session, if you missed, with the ISSB about a few weeks ago, actually now, and I just really wanted to highlight the preparedness of companies. And these were from the polling results there. And we found that actually only 24% of participants were fully aware of the developments of ISSB, which was quite a low number, I thought. But what was encouraging is most companies are reporting using TCFD, and half of those companies are reporting using ISSB. So encouragingly, a step in the right direction. And Harriet will pick up on more on that later. But what really worried me was the preparedness of organizations, with only 3% feeling very prepared to deal with things. So I wanted to just let you know that we will be continuing our focus on really trying to understand what that all means for preparers. And we'll be holding a number of workshops around that when the time comes. So please continue to engage with us and come and share your experiences and challenges, and hopefully we can help solve them together. So enough about that. Now, what I wanted to do before I hand over to Harriet to run through the research this year, I wanted to just introduce our 6 principles of trust. And our 6 principles of trust are something that have underpinned our research for a number of years now. They were first introduced by Anne Kirkaby a few years ago when she joined the team, which was a really great evolution. And we really believe that these principles of trust should be at the top of every board agenda. And we really believe that will help companies navigate to, I think, really big points that Paul Polman, one of my personal heroes in business, shared recently. And it was when he was talking about companies and what companies need to think about. The first point he said was, companies of tomorrow will realize that to reward investors, companies of tomorrow will realize that to reward investors, it is a result of running a business that serves others, not a primary goal, which I think is so important. So it's about serving stakeholders, and then shareholders will benefit from that. And the second point was that companies today need to take ownership of all company impacts. So they must think more broadly about how they affect the world, and stakeholders increasingly expect companies to understand all the ways they affect people and the planet. So enough from me, over to Harriet to share with you the research.
Thanks, Sally. That's great. Thank you so much. So the way that this part of the presentation will work is we're just going to run through those 6 principles of trust. So the team, the strategy and insight team at Black Sun, have gone through all of the FTSE 100 reports and use that as a sort of guide to look at some sort of statistical data and then also some thematic data. And what we're sharing with you today is a little bit of an insight into those things. And of course, we all know now that purpose, following the code requirements, the company needs to have set its purpose and then needs to demonstrate that that's aligned properly with the strategy, culture and values and so on. And that's really come through completely. We're seeing that very, very well established now. We're seeing it also sort of the leadership within businesses taking ownership of that and talking to that point particularly strongly. So that's 85% of companies discussing it in their leadership statements. And of course, then again, using it in the strategy overview section. And we're certainly seeing that across the board with our clients. And then we're also seeing that there's an increasing sort of use of purpose in case studies. So it's instead of where we used to see strategy in action all the time, a very well sort of established piece, we're now beginning to see purpose in action too, and how we live our purpose behaviors that we're proud of and so on. So these things are very encouraging. We're beginning to see that purpose piece that we were talking about initially. It must run through the whole report. That's certainly beginning to gain real momentum now. In terms of sort of thematically, the way that companies are are beginning to represent that is in a purpose framework. So you'll see the on the what are companies doing well. We're seeing lots and lots of good examples of this second bullet point, purpose frameworks. And that's very often with an infographic, and it takes purpose through to strategy, through to stakeholders, culture, values. And I think in sort of probably best practice, we're also seeing it running all the way through to remuneration. So that piece runs through, and then page drivers are used to unify that through the report. And that's really nice, strong reporting, and encouraging to see. What could companies do better? I think there's a potential for companies to begin to think about how the sort of embedding of purpose and how purpose informs decisions to be monitored, and what the board does to make sure that that's really happening, whether it's talking to employees about that or customers, or making sure that purpose is from time to time discussed, you know, at a board level, and how that's informing the strategic decisions. So that's one piece. And then I think the other thing is we thought would be interesting would be if companies begin to talk a little bit more about how purpose has helped inform them about what not to do. So, you know, in a difficult sort of decision-making process, we are getting a little bit more insight, aren't we, into sort of board's decision-making. How did purpose inform us what not to do, or take us in a new direction, probably in a time that's a little bit conflicted. The next point is about culture. Well, we know that culture, goodness, we hear about culture, you know, every day on the news, don't we? How that's, you know, such a central piece of how we're thinking about organizations and how society is being run. And of course, it's very well embedded in sort of in corporate reporting as well. We're seeing 88% of companies discussing it in their governance section. That's not surprising. Again, that's in line with the code requirement to assess and monitor culture and take remedial action if it's needed. We're seeing 37% including quite a substantial section on that, so some detailed commentary, but slightly surprisingly, because it's such a strong piece of reporting potentially, we're only seeing about 25% actually nail down and specify what are the metrics and measures that companies are using to actually assess and monitor culture in a more specific way. And there are some companies that do that very well. So for instance, Taylor Wimpey does that with an infographic. It's shown in quite some detail. Biffa is another one that's been doing that for a while. It's just a way of really bringing those things to life. What are companies doing well around culture? Well, we think that particularly post-pandemic, companies are really focusing in on initiatives that they're investing in, that they believe will help to foster a healthy culture within the organization and involve people practically from that point of view. So we're beginning to see quite a lot of good commentary around that. And then the other piece that's interesting is that bottom point on the left, which is committing to culture-related KPIs. So I think one of the things that's interesting is that companies are beginning to categorize their non-financial KPIs from time to time under a culture umbrella. And so you might talk about, so for instance, sort of gender representation across the business, and that you might call a cultural indicator. In fact, I think Auto Trader does a whole page on cultural KPIs, and they include their GHG emissions and employee engagement. That's another good cultural indicator. So we're beginning to see companies do that much more, and I think that's to be welcomed. In terms of what they might do better, we've said here, companies could probably go a little bit further with their process. That top point is saying we do assess and monitor culture, but we need to show that we check that that's working effectively from time to time. So one of the things that's been a really strong point in section 172 reporting is showing how the process by which the board is sure that it's seeing relevant section 172 information. And that sort of rigor would be very interesting to see, I think, around the culture piece as well. The next piece that we're looking at is cognitive diversity. We know that there's a new listing requirement for companies with a financial year beginning on or after the 1st of April 2022 to report on gender and ethnic diversity on their boards and senior management. So that's coming along. So there's going to be a little bit more scrutiny here. And we're seeing companies doing well with their Hampton Alexander Review gender diversity targets and discussion, again with the Parker review on ethnic diversity as well. So that's coming through strongly. We saw about half the companies talking about their targets around diversity, but we suspect that perhaps some companies have got there, so they're not making it explicit in the same way. So they probably all have some targets, but that transparency piece we think we'll be seeing more of in the future. And then the really important piece is that we're not seeing it moving down below the board level, really, or senior management level. We're expecting, I think, over time to see much more on the wider workforce. But if you look at companies in sectors like the media sector, so ITV, for instance, they've got really detailed disclosures across their workforce piece. So that might be, they've got gender, ethnicity, they've got LGBT plus, they've got disability as well. And that's looking at employees, representation on screen, and then also their production people behind. So it's quite a full picture. And I think that sort of best practice will be what people are going to be aiming for a little bit more. In terms of what companies are doing well, we think that sort of ITV piece would be something to aim for. And what they could be doing better, well, perhaps one of the interesting points that the FRC has looked into in their research is this piece around managing a more diverse board and managing a more diverse workforce, and what are the challenges there. And they've also sort of had a kind of call to action with boards, which is to say, achieving greater diversity, in particular cognitive diversity, that's quite a difficult thing to do. So each board member should be expected to use their network to try to extend the diversity of the board through their recruitment and succession planning, if they possibly can. Just one other thing to mention on the ITV piece, which I think is also interesting in terms of the cognitive diversity, is they do actually do a breakdown linking to the Social Mobility Commission, but they talk about professional socioeconomic backgrounds, intermediate socioeconomic backgrounds, and working class socioeconomic backgrounds. So they are bringing in that piece, which is unusual at the moment in corporate reporting. If we just look at stakeholder engagement, well, we all know that that's an absolutely central sort of plank of the way that we're reporting in our annual reports now. And we're seeing that sort of working through with the data that we're showing here. 58% leadership statements making that link between stakeholder engagement and strategy, which it's good to see that coming through. We've got the 82% now providing a very detailed Section 172 statement. It's taken a little bit of time for that to come through, but best practice is very well established there too. And no longer are we seeing just a small index of disclosures. There's a little bit of a tendency for companies to talk really about stakeholders only in their Section 172 rather than the A2F criteria. So there's still potential to move it further forward, but that's definitely a well-established piece. And then 49% are going into some real detail in a selection of key decisions. So our client Taylor Wimpey does a very strong job of that. People like Severn Trent do that as well. It's just really bringing it to life, putting a little spotlight onto a few of the key decisions, and ideally then linking it back to the A2F criteria and the outcomes for stakeholders too. If we look at the stakeholder engagement in terms of what we think companies are doing very well, one of the things that we're just beginning to see, and the FRC have been sort of advocating it, is the use of stakeholder engagement metrics. So as we look through, we might look at what the stakeholders, who are the stakeholders and what's important to them and so on. What are the engagement metrics that we are following to make sure that engagement is effective? And again, that links through to another FRC recommendation, which is to look more closely in their stakeholder engagement in Section 172 guidance, look more closely at how the strength of the relationships with stakeholders will affect the long-term prospects of the business. So really putting a lot of emphasis on the value that those relationships bring. We've got a little bit more on the sort of providing commentary on providing commentary on the outcomes. We're seeing a little bit more about that. One of our clients, NatWest, did an interesting sort of piece of detail there. They looked at how we engaged, how we discussed, the outcomes of engagement, and then the challenges that we faced. For instance, what did our customers think about branch closures? So they were very careful about sort of, creating a sort of balanced view. So we know that stakeholder engagement is quite complex, doesn't always go very positively, and that transparency piece worked very, very well for them. What could companies do better? It's probably a little bit more granularity around that, that stakeholder relationship piece, maybe even in terms of the business model, what's the role that the stakeholders are actually playing and what's the value that they're bringing. So we'd hope to see a little bit more around that. Responsible business. Well, this is sort of, you know, it's a very, very broad area, isn't it? Whether you're talking in financial services businesses about, you know, sort of responsible stewardship in terms of investments, or, you know, or all businesses in the way that they're approaching things. But we're now seeing, from our point of view, when we're looking at this research, we looked at this sort of sustainability piece under responsible business, this broader sustainability and ESG piece. And we're now seeing that 60% of companies include sustainability as one of their strategic pillars. It obviously helps with the discussion of it. Some companies are moving further down that sort of line than others, but certainly we're seeing it there. And then just in terms of materiality, we're seeing about a third, a little bit over a third of companies, including a materiality assessment in their annual report. Very few, we think, at the moment discussing double materiality, but we are seeing that represented, and then a few of them are just signposting away and keeping it in their ESG supplement or their sustainability report. But we are seeing a little bit more there, and we think a little bit more rigor around how regularly those materiality assessments are happening. So what could companies do? What are they doing well? What could they do better? We think that it's encouraging to see that ESG metrics are really now being quite regularly embedded into remuneration. We expect to see more of that as TCFD sort of guidance requirement. So we're expecting to see that coming through, but particularly around you know, variable remuneration, certainly seeing more of that. What could they do better? We think probably a little bit more on sort of materiality in terms of, I was saying that rigor, but also perhaps a bit more transparency over exactly what the ESG metrics are that are being followed. And DS Smith is one of our clients who does that very well with their Now and Next sustainability strategy. And they go into real detail about what it is that they're going to be doing with, for instance, helping their designers understand the circular economy by 2025 and so on. But it's all that very specific information that's linking into their sustainability piece, which is being tracked. So more transparency there would be great. Then the last theme that we look at of the 6 principles of trust, number 6, transformational and long-term planning. What we're seeing here in particular, the way that we've approached this is not surprisingly, given last year's being the first year that premium listed businesses needed to report on TCFD. We've really taken a sort of TCFD and climate focused approach to this area. We're seeing 62% of companies including a compliance statement, only 9% doing their costed financial impacts, whether that's like an informer doing estimate or others doing the bands of possible financial impacts, and then 14% providing a net zero roadmap within the annual report. And this is, of course, an area where we think there's a lot of potential to move disclosures forward. That's without doubt. So we know that it's a requirement of TCFD to be able to explain what you're not disclosing in accordance with the requirements, and when you expect to be able to do so. So this idea of a disclosure roadmap is also quite an interesting one for companies. But we're certainly expecting to see more, and we've been talking to the big 4 audit firms, of course, to sort of try and gauge where the consensus view is on these sorts of reporting in these sorts of areas. We had an interesting set of conversations around compliance statements, for instance, still working towards real consensus on how that should be presented, whether it's, you know, just looking at the 4 main areas or the 11 criteria within the framework. But certainly we're seeing that, you know, most companies, you saw there 2/3 of companies are using a compliance statement or a consistency statement. And we think that that's the way that things will be going in the future. The other part of the research that we provided this year was to behind that sort of big 6 principles of trust piece was to do what we call a deep dive. And I'll hand over to James now to just take you through the 3 deep dives that will be in the final report that we're publishing as part of this research.
And just before we do that, Harriet, I'm going to butt in.
Sorry.
Yeah, no. I've got a couple of questions that have come up already, and keep them coming, please. So I just thought I'd pause. That was so informative. Thanks so much. And I know that it's only a fraction of sort of the insights that we've seen this year. But one of the questions was in terms of progress overall. You gave us a lot of progress in a lot of different areas, but in your view, what area of progress in reporting was the most marked overall, looking at all of that, taking all of that into consideration?
Yeah, that's a really good question, but I think there's a sort of a very obvious answer, which is probably climate, because, you know, almost all companies were looking at that in much more detail with more rigor for the first time this time around. So that's a sort of, you know, that was one kind of specific thing, but I think that the integration of ESG and sustainability into the whole of reporting, particularly around strategy, was definitely the piece that we were seeing companies right from the beginning. So when we were talking to them at the beginning of our process, we have a kickoff meeting and we talk about regs, and they talk to us about their priorities. For I would say the vast majority of our clients would be saying, you know, this is something that we're really interested in doing. How do we demonstrate the good work that we're achieving in embedding sustainability and setting stretching targets and beginning on the road to meeting those as well? Super.
Great answer. Actually, I'm going to launch a quick poll as well, just to get a sense of what the audience is saying before we move on to the next section. So there's the poll. And in the meantime, I just wanted to have Harriet, you think about another question that's come in. I'll give you a minute.
Okay,
what sort of innovation in reporting? So have you seen this year? So we're looking, if somebody wants to know about innovations, what's the biggest innovations that you've seen? And I'll give you a minute to think about that while people complete the polling. And actually, while everybody's doing that, I wanted to give a big shout out to all the people that have helped behind the scenes on this research, because there's obviously loads of people involved, but, you know, from our clients who inspire us to do it and challenge us to know what's going on, to the team, and that would be my team primarily, that collects, analyzes, and writes the research. So a big shout out to them, because it's been a busy old few months doing all that. To the team that makes our insights look fabulous, and to the team that gets us in front of you to share it with. So I just big shout out to the Black Sun team in the meantime. And Harriet, hopefully that's given you enough time to think about the innovation question. So over to you.
Oh, thank you. It did. Thank you. I thought an innovation that is worth mentioning was about one of our clients, NatWest, did a very nice set of videos that they released at the same time as their annual report. I'm slightly conscious that I'm only talking about the annual report, and one of the key things that we'd like to discuss is how that we can leverage all of that wonderful work and content online. And they did their strategy, and then strategy in action. And then each of the strategy and action pieces had a QR code that would link to their corporate website, where there was a video to bring it to life. And so, for instance, there would be a customer, she was a school teacher, and she really needed to buy a car. And so how was she going to be able to get set about doing that? And there was rather nice sort of touches. So you had her with her sort of, because of lockdown, you know, and working remotely, we got her, and then we'd got her the personal banker in a home environment background, actually. So that was sort of brought it to life. Then there was another person who wanted to set up a florist shop, and NatWest was able to support them with the technology that made payment processes much easier and all those sorts of things. But I thought that link, that immediate link when you have the annual report open on your screen and you click the QR code, straight through to some really lovely, rich content that will speak to different stakeholders as well. It's a really nice piece of innovation this year.
Okay, great example. Okay, I've got the polling results, which I'm going to share very quickly, and then we can move on to James, and then I'll try to take more questions at the end, so please keep them coming. So the polling results, we asked you which areas of corporate reporting represent the greatest challenge currently. So sustainability disclosures across various frameworks. Number one, yes, I can see that. We've talked a little bit about that. Net zero transition plans and TCFD disclosures. And also, I think, importantly, managing disclosures across the whole reporting suite. So all these challenges are very recognized by us, and we're working with clients every day to try to help them navigate this moving forward. The next question was, what reporting goals are most relevant to you and your company this year? And not surprisingly, improving the integration of ESG and sustainability information is the number one focus area. So that's very in line with our thinking and where we're moving forward. So hopefully we've given you some ideas on how to do that better, and we'll continue to do that. And then the third question I asked was, which communications objectives matter most to you and your company? And this is exactly what I wanted to hear, telling our story in a consistent and joined up way. And I think that for many will mean across the report, but more importantly, across your reporting and wider communications to all of your different stakeholders. So that's really great. Now, the last question is a bit of a cheeky one we threw in terms of the board, because we want to know how boards are reacting to the changing environment. So in which of the following areas do you see the skills gaps amongst the board? Interestingly, the two areas that are most important, we know from our research, climate and TCFD, and ESG and sustainability. So we need to get those boards up to speed, don't we? And if your boards are not involved in the organization called Chapter Zero, I encourage them to get involved. It's a network that is very focused on climate and helping boards navigate that. So now I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to pass it over to James now to take us through some of the deep dives. And just so you're aware, we're just going to top line this. There's, of course, a full report that we publish like we have done every year. So we're just really giving you a flavor of what's in that report this year. So over to you, James.
Thank you, Sally. Yeah, so I'm going to give you some very top line remarks regarding these three areas of deep dive for the report, which will be following shortly after this webinar in the next few days. So we looked at materiality, and both Sally and Harriet have talked about this a little bit already. But certainly, if I make a couple of remarks about materiality, we certainly are seeing a shift in how companies are using different methodologies. And that is right across the board. But also something that is increasingly topical is this concept of double materiality. And in fact, we've actually seen more talk about this, although really only just a handful of companies are applying this concept. So sometimes they refer to double materiality or even dynamic materiality. And obviously, sort of the difference being that one is referred to financial materiality, or impact inwards, when a company identifies and assesses those sustainability issues that influence the enterprise value. Obviously, the main information would be useful for investors and lenders and other creditors, for example, very much in line with the ISSB definition. And then the other being referred to as environmental or social materiality, or impacts outwards, when the company is identifying and assessing the sustainability issues that impact the economy, environment, and people. And the audience is a much broader set of stakeholders, whether it be governments, key opinion formers, end users, consumers, business partners, etc. So certainly we're seeing some more space in this. And interesting just seeing on the poll then that materiality probably still featured as number 3 in terms of a focus area for boards or where they feel that they might need some greater education and insight.
And James, I was just going to add, it's fair to say this is an area that is of deep interest to us, and we're working with a number of clients on how to navigate materiality through the materiality assessment processes and evolving them to take into consideration dynamic and double materiality. And I think it's something that we'll probably hold a separate session on, because I think it's too complicated to get into right now. So I know there's a few questions on it, but we will be picking it up in a separate session, and there is a feature in the research this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sally. Excuse me. And then thinking about diversity and inclusion. So, I mean, the Hampton-Alexander Review now is just over 6 years old. They've just published their most recent report in February 2022, if you want to take a look into that. But against the backdrop of that work, at present, we're seeing that from our research, it's still, in terms of women in leadership roles and positions, it's still less than around a third or 30% of those senior leadership positions are held by women. So there's still certainly some way to go in that regard. But then if we think about the target around board members from ethnic minorities, as of the end of the financial year for a lot of listed businesses, obviously in the UK, December 2021, 89% or 89 companies met that target, but only only around 6 CEOs from the entire FTSE 100 came from minority ethnic background. So there's quite a lot of work to do, perhaps in that space there as well. And then just moving on to,
I was just going to say, just before you go on, and many of you might have picked up that a couple of days ago in the EU, they passed some draft legislation, which is trying to address this issue of gender parity on boards of public listed companies in the EU. And they're putting in a target of at least 40% of non-executive directors, or 33% of all director posts are occupied by an underrepresented sex. So there's going to be a huge focus on this increasing moving forward.
Thank you, Sally. Yeah, no, it is very topical. And as I mentioned, the most recent report from the Hampton-Alexander Review was just published 3 months ago. So certainly worth a look at that to see, if you'd like more information and deep dive on that. So with regards to TCFD, we've obviously talked about this quite a lot. Is an area that we're increasingly helping and assisting clients with to navigate around the whole climate risk area. And certainly the compliance statements, as it was a requirement, are being used by the majority of companies listed on the FTSE 100, but they vary in approach in terms of breadth, depth, maturity, complexity, and to be honest, usefulness. And despite obviously TCFD being around for quite a few years now, obviously initially the focus was for the financial sector and insurance sector. At present, and obviously the clue's in the name, it's around financial disclosure. Only around 9% of FTSE 100 are actually starting to properly quantify the impacts of climate change. So they're actually putting quantitative values associated with whether they be transitional or physical risks of climate change. And as you saw on our poll, very topically, there some of the areas that are probably giving people food for thought and thinking about how they're going to progress with their net zero plans and transition plans. And certainly we are seeing the need for people to tell a more authentic, transparent story about that. And obviously that all comes down to, have you costed your transition plan? Can you start to quantify that? Because if the CFO is not already asking you about it, then investors certainly will do. So again, we do a deep dive on TCFD, and perhaps as when we follow up on the webinar, we could resend the white paper that we wrote based on our event at the beginning of the year. So that was one of our Horizon Series documents that we can share with this audience that will give some useful trends and insights into TCFD. So I'll hand back to Sally.
Super. Thanks, James. That was really insightful. Great. I've had a couple questions coming in. I'm going to try to just combine them a bit. So a few questions around while we wait for the new ISSB standards. what can companies do to prepare themselves for the new disclosure requirements? I don't know, Harriet, do you want to sort of try to address that one? Because I know it's something very top of mind with all of our clients.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely the big challenge, isn't it? Because financial disclosures, you know, or sustainability disclosures beginning to be seen to be on a par with financial disclosures is a really significant change. I think in our conversations with the ISSB, and Sally alluded to the webinar that we did with them, they've definitely, their sort of strong advice, I think, is for companies to have a look at the exposure drafts that they've published. There's a general one and there's one specific to TCFD, just to understand what sorts of things, what sorts of disclosures they'll be asked to provide in due course. So I think that's, you know, sort of in terms of preparedness, you know, and then looking at a gap analysis, working out which parts are material in terms of enterprise value, you know, having a really good think about that. But I think this, you know, this was one of the things that we all talked about when we were addressing this piece of research and the themes that we should be using. You know, it's exactly goes to the heart of this, which is if you can't really afford not to look forward to what new disclosures are going to be required, because it is that sort of, you know, if you standing still, my goodness, certainly others will be you know, accelerating forward past you. So that is, I think, the piece is, you know, equip yourselves by ourselves by getting very familiar with the sorts of things that will be asked for.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, continue doing what you're doing, because a lot of you are already focused on TCFD. You're already taking into consideration ISSB. And I know from lots of conversations, the integrated reporting principles provide a kind of guideline and a framework, and those have been recently endorsed by ISSB. And as you all know, hopefully all those bodies have been integrated into the ISSB. So lots in that area. Okay, a couple other questions. Now there's a question here. James, this is probably best for you, and it's following on from the impact question, is how best do you think SDGs should be used in reporting? What do you think about that?
Well, thank you, Sally. So just for explanation, if everybody's not familiar with that, TLA, Sustainable Development Goals, so this is the UN Sustainable Development Goals launched in the lead up to the Paris Climate Summit in December 2015. These were hot on the tail coats of the Millennium Development Goals, and the SDGs run from 2015 to 2030. So we're already halfway through. Obviously originally intended, or principally intended, for sort of supranational bodies and governments, but obviously business has certainly got a role to play to contribute towards their delivery. I think really companies need to be transparent and to talk and articulate authentically about the progress that they are making towards these. There are 17 goals. They are supported by 169 targets and more than 200 indicators. So in reality, you're not going to be able to make a contribution to every single goal, to every single supporting target. And so I think taking time, taking stock to actually perhaps prioritize which goals you think you can have the greatest impact, which ones are the most, dare I say, material to your own operations, to your own business, and to think about not only when you report, to look backwards as well as forwards, to talk about and to celebrate how you may have contributed through your own ESG or sustainability strategy and program towards those goals, and where is the maybe the greatest connectivity, but also to outline what are you going to be working on going forwards. If you can talk about any kind of robust methodology about how you may have arrived at which goals are material for you, that would be great. And something that we have seen talked about out there in the ESG space is about, you know, rainbow washing, about not over egging necessarily your contribution. You know, realistically, maybe you'd be able to make a contribution to 4, 5, or 6 goals, but if you perhaps were able to claim that you may be able to make a contribution towards perhaps all 17, then either you're an immensely mature business with amazing resources to be able to do that, but perhaps the reality is maybe a smaller number that you can actually make a greater impact and have a more mature, joined up story to tell.
Yeah, and I think that last point is a really pertinent one, James, the focus on what actually can you make the greatest impact on. And I think that's what investors and other stakeholders are looking for companies to really identify where they can actually make a change. So that's really helpful. Okay, keep the questions coming. There's another one here actually on sustainability teams. So this is an interesting one. James, what do you think are the biggest challenge for sustainability teams within a corporate environment, given all this change? How would you answer that? And maybe you have some tips for sustainability professionals that are on the line, because I know there are a lot of them with us today.
No, absolutely. I mean, I guess for background, I've spent more than 20 years working in sustainability, and 15 of those were in-house in sort of corporate sustainability departments. So hopefully I'm speaking from both perspectives in that regard. I guess there's a lot of things on the plates of sustainability professionals right now, and just looking at the very buoyant job market in sustainability roles, there are roles popping up in all places all the time, and there's perhaps an overused expression, there is a war on talent right now, and as companies grapple to prepare for these additional reporting requirements, there was a real need to strengthen the breadth of experience that they have. So often sustainability professionals in in-house environments, in in-house departments rather, certainly there is often a bandwidth sort of issue. And so I think there's a real need for, and I guess if I think about this through the TCFD lens or climate risk, net zero, and to Harriet's point about that almost coming together of the focus of ESG and financial disclosure, a greater sort of harmonization and crossover, I think one of the best things to do is for sustainability professionals, certainly to reach out, if they haven't already done so, to reach out and to really collaborate and work more frequently with colleagues in some of those key internal departments, whether it be in the company secretary department, in communications, in finance, in risk, in comms, public affairs, etc. Because a lot of these issues are going to fall on the plate of multiple departments, and perhaps if you were to rather divide and conquer, but perhaps work together more collaboratively, there might be a way of addressing these increasing demands. Certainly, I would also encourage anybody who is a sustainability professional, if they haven't already reached out to one of the leading professional membership organizations, whether ICRS or IEMA, is to look at what and how they might be able to support individuals on their own development, on improving and increasing their skills base as well. And certainly, embracing integrated thinking and integrated collaboration is key, because increasingly, if we look at some of the themes in the reports that we've analysed, there is this increased sort of overlap between ESG, sustainability, and some of the core content that has to go into the strategic report in the front end of the annual report. So for me, collaboration is king, and sustainability is a great place and a great department or area to work in, because it gives you the opportunity, in my experience, to work with so many different people from so many different parts of the business, and it just is a great opportunity to really increase your knowledge about how businesses tick.
Yeah, really helpful insights. Thanks, James. Actually, Harriet, did you want to add anything to that from your experience of working with companies over the years and how that's changed? It'd be just really interesting to hear your perspective as well on how to address it the other side.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's definitely something that's preoccupying us, I think, which is this theme about the governance of sustainability, how that's going to work, because we know we've seen increasingly with TCFD that the TCFD disclosures were normally sort of clustering under the remit of the CFO. So where sustainability information has previously been sort of coming from the bottom up through the sustainability sort of department, as it were, suddenly because of that financial disclosure piece, it's been taken through the audit committee very often in the CFO. So it's like coming together of these skill sets, because obviously it goes without saying, the audit committee may not be extremely well skilled in fully skilled in sustainability technicality, and the same is true from the other side. And it's managing how to bring those two pieces together, and then looking at how governance can be made to be sufficiently robust for it really to work over the longer term. So with ISSB and everything else coming along, that's a theme that we think is going to be super interesting.
Yeah, super, really helpful, Harriet. Thank you. Now, I've got another actual question that somebody's put in the chat box. Mindful of the trends identified in the research presented today, what do you think the future of effective and efficient reporting suites looks like for corporates? Is it still annual report core? Can you talk to us a little bit more about channels and trends, please? And I know this is something that we're deeply involved with a number of clients on trying to sort of navigate. Don't know, James, do you want to kick us off, and then maybe Harriet, you could add?
Yeah, no, sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. This is something that is very top of mind for some of the clients that we're working with. So big, complex organizations who've got broad and deep reporting suites. And some of those clients have talked to us recently about, well, how do we get the most out of the work that we do? How do we get those key messages across? Because there's obviously some overlap, certainly with ESG and sustainability content in annual reports, in climate reports, in sustainability reports on websites. So I guess, in our nature, in our DNA as an agency, it is our job to try and help the organizations that we work with and support to tell the best possible story. And I guess to perhaps help them move from, in some cases, compliance to real communications and storytelling. And Harriet gave the example about NatWest, who we worked with last year, across a broad suite of reports. And Harriet gave the examples about using innovation. So I guess it also comes down to what extent have you as a business done a deep dive and spoken to your external stakeholders about what is it that they want, where what are the key information, how do they like to consume your content, how do they like that content to be presented. Conversations that we have with clients on a regular basis are around, is it digital first now? Is it digital first only? Is it hard copy usage? Is that still going on? Some of the trends we're starting to see is that reports are now moving to a landscape style, because the number one channel for consumption is digital. So that's starting to make some companies think about how they actually present, orientate their content. But essentially, some of the work that we're doing is about trying to be a critical friend and help to ask some of these probing questions about what is the purpose of your reporting in the first place, and trying to ensure that they get their message across to as many stakeholders as possible, but in the right format and at the right level of detail, of granularity accordingly.
Thanks, James. Harry, did you want to add anything to that, or should?
Yeah, I was just thinking from a practical perspective. I really liked that response that came through on the polling that said, one of the big challenges is telling a consistent story across the piece, and that's definitely something that we're looking at a lot more. I think we're seeing a few things. I think we're seeing more at the beginning of the annual report, more companies explaining what their reporting suite looks like and where you find what. And I think there are companies, lots of companies are doing that very well. With NatWest, we a lot of different pieces of information came out at the same time. So you had the annual report, the ESG supplement, which is like a sustainability report, very substantial, TCFD report, and then NatWest Markets annual report, all came out at the same time, on the same day, with the videos and everything else. So that there's a kind of the simultaneous release of information is something to consider. Where do people find what they're looking for? Tesco's very good actually in their reporting hub. That's worth a look. They go through sort of different reports and fact sheets, which is from the sort of stakeholder upwards, as it were. So I think those are important things. So I think sort of how where do you put things? And then the final piece that we're debating all of the time is how do we manage the annual report so that it captures all of the really material information, and signposts away to different documents in an effective way without leaving gaps. And that's, I think, the increasing challenge is, how do we obviously the report can't just get bigger and bigger. So it's working out how to do that intelligently and to make all the pieces fit together.
Yeah, and all good points. And I think I'd just reinforce that companies need to own their own story and understand what it is that they want to communicate externally, and also make sure that reporting isn't just for reporting's sake. It forms a fundamental part of your communications and engagement strategy with all of your stakeholders. So I think it's important that we do that. Okay, I'm not going to be able to take any more questions, but what I will do is I'm going to launch the last poll, if I could, and then we've just got a few things that I wanted to just sort of share with you. The last poll really asks you, we want to know from you what you want to hear about from us. And then we'd also love some feedback on what you thought about the session today and what some of your priorities are moving forward. But if we flick to the next slide, Harriet, I just wanted to share with you some of the trends that we've talked about, but the additional developments that we think will impact reporting, or we know will impact reporting. You know, the role of the board, I think, is really super, super important, and needs to be a lot of focus on that moving forward. ISSB represents a seismic shift in terms of so many things, but this idea of really elevating sustainability to the same level as financial. And what does that mean? What does that look like? How do we actually get the processes in place, the right data, but the robustness, the internal control, all that around that, and more importantly, how do we connect that information? So a lot to watch in there. We talked about costed transition plans. We talked a little bit about formats and locations. Also digitally enabled reporting. One thing we didn't talk about, but is high on the agenda as well, I think, this accountability and greenwashing. And I think that as we, pick up paper, any paper, there's a lot of scrutiny in the marketplace right now. So this is really about the rigor behind what companies say or claim about what they're doing. And I think that's really important. So I think that generally one of the biggest feedback from investors is that, particularly around net zero and all these plans around climate is great, but how are you going to get there? What are you actually doing to get there? And specifically outlining that action plan with clear targets and commitments and progress against those targets. So I think that's going to be really important moving forward. The other thing is leadership and direction. Much more is expected of CEOs and boards around leadership, vision, and accountability to really drive more purposeful businesses. And I think importantly, this idea of collaboration. Collaboration as a theme, I think, not just within businesses, which is going to be really important, but also within the environment more broadly, with all the different standard setters and everything. So that's all I wanted to share, just to flick through, just to share with you a little bit about some of the things that we're getting up to. And then lucky last, I wanted to just leave you with the events that we've got upcoming. I mentioned a few of them. The Web 100 launches in 2 weeks' time on the 21st of June. How a board can make sense of ESG. We're doing in partnership with Building Better Boards and Seamus Gillen, which is on Thursday, the 23rd of June. Love to see some of you there for that one. And then our annual event with the FRC, what's next for governance and reporting. Really looking forward to having a live in-person event and seeing lots of you there. So I think that is it right on 11 o'clock. Thank you so much, everybody, for hanging in there. Really appreciate seeing all of you and looking forward to following up on a lot of these conversations moving forward. Take care. Have a great day.